everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and a warm welcome to the GCSP. What an opportunity to meet here in Maison de la Paix, the House of Peace, and in international Geneva, the capital of peace. And more specifically, of course, it's the capital of proclaiming and promoting human rights. We meet at a time, and I read in the brief for our meeting here, when exclusion, discrimination, and human rights violations are driving and prolonging conflicts. Respect for the rule of law and accountability is rapidly decreasing around the world, in most, if not all, countries. My name is Annika Hilding Norberg, and on behalf of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, it is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this launching conversation on the role and impacts of human rights in UN peace operations. What can new research tell us about current practice? And possibly even more importantly, what is required and desired as we intensify preparations for the increasingly rocky road ahead? Indeed, how can strengthening a rights-based approach to UN peace operations make a real difference to the effectiveness and impact of missions and operations, and ultimately to people they are deployed to protect, the women, men, and children, increasingly, as we witness, under siege? What operational insights have our panelists and their teams been able to draw that can shed new light on how to best prepare, decide, and deliver mandate implementation with an integrated human rights dimension, fully realized and operationalized? Well, this we will dive into, uncover, and discover shortly. Before I hand over to the Swiss Federal Department for Foreign Affairs, Damiano, let me congratulate already now the research teams at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, the Center for Civilians in Conflict and the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, and everyone else who have contributed to the study. I know it's a significant undertaking. We believe that the study could not come more timely. As an early contribution to the project, GCSP was pleased to contribute with resources for a framing of some of the core issues that later was researched by the project. So you will see this one, a policy brief, which was developed by Charlie Hunt and Adam Day. And you can find it online. In addition, the relevance of the topic was repeatedly highlighted only earlier this week when we organized and facilitated the UN Police Division's leadership team retreat on the future of UN policing here in Stans in Switzerland. And both Charlie and Wendy were two of the contributors to that session. So, and of course, we are also very much looking forward to learning from the second study to be presented, developed by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. So, colleagues, the topic is here. The research findings are ready, and we in the audience are eagerly anticipating the conversation. None of this, however, would have been possible without the supporting partnership and the donor governments. Damiano, it's over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm happy to see so many people attending. I suppose many more online, despite Geneva being very busy right now with the Human Rights Council, I suppose. So let me join Annika in thanking the research team, especially the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, and the United Nations University Center for Policy Research for presenting today the study on the role of and impact of human rights in UN peace operations. As you're marking this year the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and 25 years of UN protection of civilians mandates, this ambitious study comes indeed very timely. Since the deployment of the first peacekeeping mission 75 years ago, The nature of conflicts and the mandates of missions have changed considerably. UN peace operations have increasingly included strong human rights mandates, and the responsibility to protect civilians has been included to all parts of peacekeeping mission, be it civilian or military, and police, of course, that you mentioned before. At the same time, UN peace operations are now increasingly facing challenges, and I quote the UN Secretary General in his new Agenda for Peace. The gap between United Nations peacekeeping mandates and what such missions can actually deliver in practice has become apparent. The challenges posed by long-standing and unresolved conflicts without a peace to keep, driven by complex domestic, geopolitical and transnational factors, serve as a stark illustration of the limitations of ambitious mandates without adequate political support. Now, the analysis of the Secretary General concisely illustrates that today new important challenges are to be met, and that without political will, both in host countries and among the UN member states at large, harm to civilians or even relapse into war cannot be prevented. Peacekeeping cannot and was never meant to substitute for political will of member states and the ultimate responsibility to protect civilians and promote human rights. In this regard, as emphasized by the Secretary General, there is a need to seriously reflect on the future of peacekeeping, and Switzerland is proud to partner with all these organizations in different projects to support this reflection process. This is one study, and there are more to come actually on the relationship between peace building and human rights, but also on the future of peacekeeping. Now, keeping the inherent limitations in mind that I mentioned before, this study offers particular insights into what peacekeeping missions and the human rights components in particular can achieve. How are human rights tasks being implemented by peace operations? Or, very importantly, how can human rights form a more central element of mission transitions? This is particularly important knowing that we are facing actually a few important reconfigurations of missions in the coming year. And Switzerland is particularly interested in that topic, being a member of the Security Council, of course. In some contexts, such as the DRC, where a transition is taking place, human rights-focused presence remains some of the most crucial bridges to diminish harmful effects of conflicts on civilians. For instance, in the Kasai province, I think the human rights component was key to support the transition. And there, too, there was a perfect link between the peacekeeping transition and the peace-building fund, who was able to promote joint-up programs with a strong protection focus. I visited those projects last year, and I could witness the importance of this continuum, and that we are not allowing any gaps to appear in the transition. I was happy to read in the report your reflection on that and recommendations in this regard. Now, I've spoken too much already because we want to listen to the panel, and I look forward to a stimulating and fruitful exchange. I have the pleasure to give the floor to Wendy McClinchy, Director for the UN Program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. She will lead us through the discussion, through the panel discussion and the Q&A. Thank you very much for coming and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Damiano. Hope everyone can hear me okay. First, thanks to all of you for making the time today to join us on this really important topic. And for those of you online, we're not forgetting about you. Thank you so much also for your time. I'm sorry that you'll miss out on the lunch, but you can at least enjoy the session in your pajamas. So I think first, thanks so much to the government of Switzerland for the support that made this research possible. Also the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who weren't able to join us in person today, but who've been supporting this work for quite some time. And for GCSP, of course, for hosting us and providing this really fantastic venue for today's event. And I think, as the opening remarks also echoed, I think while there's this feeling that human rights are always under attack, it so feels especially true at this sort of moment in in time when we have this retrenchment, what feels like a sort of retrenchment of human rights, and especially in these sort of big anniversaries, which really allow us to be a bit reflective. So 75 years of human rights, we have 25 years of protection of civilians mandates happening this year, and there are a whole string of events that will be happening in various places, including and especially New York, to commemorate those anniversaries. But I think also as we see sort of compounding challenges are for some of our biggest and sort of most equipped peace and security instruments in the form of some of these bigger peacekeeping operations that are facing stress. Including from the human rights work, the really vital human rights work that they do, withdrawals and drawdowns and political pressure and diminishing space to be able to operate. Not to say that those instruments don't work, but the ability to do the vital work that space is simply shrinking. I think for us, that was part of the reason why we wanted to do this study was to actually depict, provide a sort of clear evidence base on exactly what how does this work contribute to the effectiveness of peace operations, and what does it look like in practice, right? So I think some of the work is maybe better known than the other, the monitoring and reporting work, I think, but some of the other work around support to human rights institutions, support to civil society, support to journalists, are addressing sort of arbitrary arrests and detentions, supporting judicial services. There's a lot more work, I think, that doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. And I think especially as we are discussing the sort of future of peace operations, as everyone is sort of talking about, these questions are much more important. What do these sort of vital contributions look like? And we know, I think we don't have to go into it here, but the role that human rights work plays in addressing really underlying grievances, right? If we're really trying to get at sort of holistic conflict prevention approaches, addressing sort of different forms of exclusion, the human rights work is really vital to that. So that's why we've done the study. We know the context. We know how challenging they are. The Secretary General's sort of new agenda for peace outlines some of these challenges and really aims to put sort of the human rights work at the center of that. We know that human rights sort of language is coming under increasing pressure in the Security Council, where we have this increased sort of paralysis of these sort of political divisions and budgetary decisions where the resources to support this work are also diminishing. So that's a bit the challenging context. We did this thematic. It's a thematic study that draws on different examples from cases in different kinds of peace operation contexts. We didn't only want to look at the big PKOs, but rather also some special political missions and some of the lesser known work of the special envoys and regional offices as well. We've heard the partners to the research. It's the Effectiveness of Peace Operations, which is a network of a really interesting and talented, diverse group of experts, including many from the regions that are implicated in the research, and that it includes NUPI, CIPRI, UNU Center for Policy Research, CIVIC, and others, the Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Training Center as well. There are, so the report is hot off the press, as it were. So I think, just posted it last night. So I'm sorry that means that you don't get printed copies in the room, but it's better for the environment anyway. So go online, please, and find it. At least here in the room, you'll see a code which you can scan to direct you to it. I think I will stop talking and we'll hand it over to Dr. Charlie Hunt, who is the lead researcher and lead author of the study. He's a senior fellow at the UNU Center for Policy Research and a professor at the Institute for Security Studies and a professor of global security at RMIT in Australia, in Melbourne. So with that, I hand it over to you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Wendy. It's interesting hearing those opening remarks from you all and thinking back to when we first came up with this idea. And it was probably about 4 years ago, actually, I think, when we'd done some work looking at the relationship between the military components in peacekeeping and human rights components. And at the time, myself and Adam, with others in the conversation, felt it was really important, and we saw that this was coming under pressure and that it was something we maybe wanted this empirical research into to try and build a base for decision making. And I think 4 years later, as you rightly put, Wendy, it couldn't be more important than ever now. So I won't repeat all the thanks. I'm glad everyone has said thank you to so many. It's been a big team effort. I should, though, add thanks to all of the co-authors, because it's been a talented, dedicated team that have come up with what is a huge report, as others have said, a huge undertaking. So the researching, writing, reviewing, and producing this, my thanks to everyone for that. And what I'll try and do now is go through about 150 pages in 15 minutes. But I want to focus really on the key findings that we've arrived at, with some of the high-level overall takeaways, perhaps a little on some of the recommendations, and a comment or two to conclude on what I think the implications are looking forward. So, as others have said, really, the key aim of the study was to explore the effects of various types of peace operations, UN peace operations, and what the effect they've had on the promotion and protection of human rights, but also how human rights work has contributed to overall mission effectiveness. So we really set out with the intent to identify novel approaches, innovations that were working well, and trying to identify why, but also seeking to reveal what the impediments are to greater effectiveness and try and explain around that what might be some of the ways to move beyond them. And so drawing lessons, comparing different types of missions, looking forward, how can we build better synergies between the human rights activities of peace operations and the other work of missions? I won't go through all of the cases, but to say that, importantly, there are 10 cases we focused on particularly, and they, as Wendy said, cut across multidimensional peacekeeping or stabilization missions in Congo, Mali, and now I'm going through them, I said I wouldn't, in Mali, Congo, and South Sudan. But then importantly, this part of a broader spectrum of field presences. So SPMs that had a Security Council mandate, as well as those that don't. Some that focus on single countries, but importantly, I think with this report, those that have a regional focus. So you can look into the report to see which specific cases, and we can talk about specific examples later. But what we ended up with was over a year of empirical research, more than 300, I think, interviews, in-depth interviews with UN and non-UN entities, civil society, community-based organizations. And the analysis that we've arrived at, I think, provides kind of these empirically based insights across 3 key areas. So I just wanted to give a few examples across each of those. On the first one, as Wendy said, I think we're more familiar perhaps with the activities and some of the effects that derive from the core OHCHR mandate that takes place within peacekeeping. So monitoring, investigation, analysis, and reporting on violations, and how they can build credibility and trust that can enable other mission activities, but also provide a basis for dialogue, engagement with local and other actors, and really working towards deterring future violations and potentially changing behavior of some. The capacity building work that human rights components are often asked to do with both state and non-state actors, local civil society, again, is another really important area, particularly the work with national human rights institutions that we heard a lot about in our fieldwork. But then the next cluster or set of insights really are slightly removed, or 1 degree of separation. This idea about human rights efforts being pertinent, but also sometimes intrinsic to other mandated priorities. So while the priorities for this raft of field missions vary quite significantly, there's some things which are common to many. And certainly we delved into the ones which are important across the different mission types. So first, and a real key focus for us was looking at the protection of civilians, and really human rights work that helps strengthen analysis of threats to civilians, can direct measures to prevent harm, as well as inform advocacy for their rights and safety in conflict zones, is a clear kind of additional value add that human rights work brings in the protection space. But it also contributes to supporting more inclusive political processes and peace agreements. So, for example, by infusing and promoting human rights norms and principles into missions' peacemaking activities, and where involved in the mediation. So this was particularly apparent and important in the special envoys offices and some of the regional strategies that they're involved in. Also extending state authority, stabilization and building state capacity, perhaps less of a core component as we look forward, but it has been a really important part of many missions. And partnering with others focused, for example, on promoting legal reform and building the capacity of local security and justice systems to ensure that human rights are respected is another area where we found lots of examples, some positive stories in there. And as I mentioned, back to the beginning of the genesis of this project, the work with uniform components, facilitating closer coordination, cooperation, even sometimes, in some cases, rare, but sometimes integration of human rights actors with military and police peacekeepers, and serving as a bridge really between those uniform components and local actors. And so the last, it's a chapter in this long report, but so these are 3 chapters of the report, but the last one is almost another derivation, another degree of separation. So not necessarily the core priorities of missions, but important and common cross-cutting functions and objectives across these field missions. So good offices is one that comes up time and again in the work, and this idea that strong and consistent impartial human rights reporting can bolster the UN's reputation for good offices at multiple levels of engagement, whether it be the SRSG down to political affairs officers and others engaged at the community level, but really supporting work on preventive diplomacy and ultimately helping to avert future cycles of violence. Protecting civic and political space, as well as through efforts to detect and combat disinformation, malinformation, and hate speech. MDMH, I'm led to believe, is the latest UN acronym that we all need to get across. But human rights sections really do play a significant role in engaging, coordinating, leading proactive measures, including devising some mission-wide strategies at times, with action plans, I think, to detect, analyze, and respond to these forms of harmful information. And there's lots of examples, perhaps we can hear a bit more about later, but the mission radio stations in places like South Sudan and Congo, where they've played an important role, particularly in the lead up to elections. And the third key area we identify and have kind of empirics around is early warning. So a lot of this is connected to the conversation about protection of civilians I've already mentioned, so I won't go into great detail, but again, beyond protection, human rights reporting and analysis also generates important early warning signals of risks, including longer term risks, importantly, some of the structural violence as well as horizontal inequalities that Wendy mentioned, really identifying risks for relapse and escalation, and often through simple information exchange mechanisms, including through integrated units like JMACs and JOCs within, to throw in another couple of acronyms, sorry. Assisting with the implementation of the human rights due diligence policy is another key area that was important across all the different field presence, different in each case, and definitely the application remains very difficult. It's not to say there are not challenges there, but human rights not necessarily as the owner of that policy and shouldn't be seen as that it's their thing to do. This is a system-wide policy, but human rights support that. And when it's done well, it can really support the safeguarding in the ways that facilitate even the path to more sustainable peace. And last but not least, in that chapter, we highlight the important role of human rights in human rights efforts and work in supporting, ensuring accountability and transitional justice. So working a lot of the field missions, making important contributions to efforts to uphold rights to truth, justice, and reparations, and really efforts to promoting efforts to hold perpetrators of human rights violations to account, collecting evidence on abuses and supporting the establishment of mechanisms to address past atrocities. So take different shapes in different forms in different mission settings, but this is something that human rights within missions continuously and repeatedly came up as an important thing. So there's some insights into the three sort of clusters of areas. And if I would try to step back or come up to 40,000 feet and look down from the plains view of what it is, what are some of the key findings and takeaways? Well, I think what our findings show is that there are some positive things to take from the experiences in the field, even in very difficult times in recent years. And so UN peace operations efforts to advance human rights do indeed contribute in some ways, sometimes to a reduction in violence levels, and really can find ways to support longer term pathways to sustainable peace. It's a significant, not without challenges, but really important thing to remember. And in this sense, peace operations are an important implementer for the UN's human rights pillar. And at the same time, those activities really help peace operations achieve those wider range of objectives I've been through. But second, what we've been able to do by having this broader spectrum of cases is to say, well, actually, these findings, some of them at least, hold across different kinds of missions and at different points in a conflict cycle or different moments in crises. So whether it's a small envoy's office or a large multi-dimensional peacekeeping mission, human rights-based engagement can enable more effective operations within the parameters of what they're doing. And whether deployed at the earliest onset of violent conflict or well after the height of the hostilities, human rights efforts within UN missions have a tangible value to add to the overall. And perhaps the last key takeaway, and it was mentioned in the introductory comments, we think an important and timely finding is that as larger missions transition out of some of the most conflict-affected settings there are, human rights-focused presences may be some of the most crucial bridges to prevent some of the more severe relapse and into violence and war. So the continued important monitoring and reporting, early warning systems, things that have been mentioned already. And I just want to emphasize that while this sounds like in some ways quite a positive take on things, we all know when we see accounts from the field that everything is not rosy. In fact, it's calamitous and catastrophic in many of the places we're talking about. So while there's good practices to draw on, it's not only a positive story. We think that in the context of the resistance to human rights language that Wendy mentioned in her opening remarks, but coupled with diminishing host state consent and heightened political sensitivities and resistance to human rights actors, this is poses serious challenges to the UN's prioritization of human rights in these settings. We shouldn't try and sugarcoat or shy away from that reality. And we don't in the report. We certainly highlight where the challenges lie, but we've tried to be constructive in terms of identifying ways that we think we can move beyond or navigate some of those sticking points. So I think I've got exactly 1 minute left to do the other 100 pages. So I won't try and cover much at all about the recommendations that we make. We can come back to that perhaps in the Q&A. But one thing I would like to mention, so we make 20 sets of recommendations for offering specific and quite concrete actions we think the UN Security Council, host governments, the Secretariat, member states and mission leadership can take to ensure they're harnessing human rights for maximum impact in these settings, as varied as they are. And so maybe I'll just flag one for now before concluding. And one of the things that a lot of our specific findings point to is the need to try and bridge better the Geneva and New York ecosystems on peace and security. So there's a great deal that's been done in the New York space to do that. OHCHR has a strong presence and does great work there. But we think that there's probably an argument to be made for finding a way to replicate some of that here in Geneva. And we can perhaps discuss that a bit more after, Wendy. And so then, with my minus 1 minute to conclude, I think if peace operations of the future, however uncertain that future is, but if they're going to be effective presences on the ground, then despite pushback and defunding and various forms of resistance, if they're going to be capable of addressing the immediate causes of violence, but also the deeper drivers of instability, then they're going to need to have strong human rights mandates and components and strong support from the architecture that enables and supports them. So that's the UN architecture, but it's also the member states. And the final thing to say is I think right now, not only the 4 years since we conceived of this idea, but right now in the context of the new Agenda for Peace, the upcoming Summit for the Future, and also things like the Agenda for Protection, which is concurrently about to be released, or just has, I think, these calls to reflect on the limits and the future of peace operations and considering new models and modalities. We think that this is a strong argument to keep human rights front and center. So negotiations are taking place right now in New York on the text of the Pact for the Future, the Zero Draft. There's quite strong human rights language in the Zero Draft, and there's some arguably helpful language on peace operations in terms of considering options going forward. But there's no sense that that will all remain in the final draft, in the final thing. So now is a moment when there needs to be strong arguments made, and we hope that this, as an empirical base, can provide some ammunition in supporting some of those lines of arguments for those who want to have a strong rights-based approach to the future of the UN's peace operations. So, and I should say that while it's the future of UN peace operations, I think in this period of flux and rethinking, actually it's a bigger question. It's about the UN's peace and security work as a whole. So peace operations will play some role and have some future in that, but it's a bigger space. So I've now gone well over my time, so I'll just say thank you for the floor, and I look forward to comments, questions, and discussion. Thanks, Wendy.
Very impressive overview of a pretty meaty report. I do hope we get into some of those details, because actually the examples are really quite rich. I mean, that was really the point, where you actually can illustrate some of the key findings that he just shared in really concrete terms that highlights how some of this work is manifesting day to day. So that gave us a bit of an overview of some of both the directly mandated work and some of this sort of cross-cutting work in ways that, again, it both directly contributes to sort of better and stronger sort of human rights protection, but also in some of the indirect ways that that work plays out. And then this, I think, really important, understanding this sort of chain between the doctrine, the policy, the tools, and then the sort of the outcomes of that work, how human rights is an enabler, how it's a bridge to kind of longer term conflict prevention and peace building. I mean, understanding all of the ways that manifests was really one of the key purposes of the research. So that's a bit of an overview. I'd like to turn to my colleague, Abigail. Ms. Abigail Gérard-Baldé is a researcher with Center for Civilians in Conflict based in The Hague. Abigail was participating in this research in Democratic Republic of Congo a few months back, where she also led other similar research on peacekeeping transitions and looking at specifically MONUSCO's drawdown and how protection of civilians was being sort of considered from a cross sort of UN system or an integrated approach, looking at what are the kinds of capacities that will be left behind, what are the roles of some of the other UN actors outside the mission in carrying forward that work, a big portion of which is around human rights. But Abigail has also worked extensively in the Sahel, where she may wish to draw other examples from. So yeah, maybe you can take us into a bit more detail from some of that field research. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. So as Wendy said, I had the opportunity to go for Civic in the DRC in September, where I've been with my colleague Claudia Pfeiffer-Cruz from CIPRI. She's online. So hi, Claudia. So we were there in September in a very, a dire moment for human rights in the DRC, a very special moment as well, because as you may know, it was just after a new bloodshed or episode of violence in Goma against protesters. It was the same week of the arrest of a prominent journalist, Anis Boujakera, who is still in jail today. And it was during actually the conversations around the renewal of the mandate of MONUSCO, with, escalation of discourses around the withdrawal of the mission, because it was just before the presidential election. So since then, as you may know, Félix Tshisekedi is still in office, is now doing his second mandate. The mandate renewal of the mission has been issued as well with a disengagement plan. But at the moment of our research, all of this was still kind of pending. So what was very interesting as well is that at the same time, a lot of uncertainties concerning just the political actors that were in play were unknown, such as the East African regional forces, because we didn't know if the mandate would be renewed or not, as well as the arrival of SADC forces. All of this changed as well since December, as you may know. So this is about the situation, a short overview of the context. But what was very interesting with all the people we could interview, so mostly interviewees from the mission, civil society organizations, civilians, diplomats, was that everyone had this, this sentence. After 25 years of mission, of presence of the UN in the DRC, we need to look at the root causes of the conflict. So it was interesting to have this sentence coming again and again. And actually the role of the human rights component is maybe the one who touched, on the root causes of the conflict around those 20 years of presence in the DRC. When you know the context of the DRC, impunity, for example, is a huge driver of the conflict. The very complicated or structural deficiencies in the rule of law is as well. So, and I don't want to repeat what Charlie already said, or Matthias will maybe say later, talking from OHCHR point of view. But what we saw during this study is the widespread role of the HR component in the DRC, with its crucial role in monitoring and reporting human rights violation. As you may know, the mission allowed almost 25 years of memory of human rights violations in the country. So if one day there will be prosecutions either from national courts, from a state that will arrive with is a universal competence, the ICC come in. Of course, the work that has been done by the UNGHRO will be a crucial resource. Apart from the monitoring and reporting, of course, we've seen that UNGHRO had a very important role in feeding the early warning and rapid response mechanisms to protect civilians. It had also a crucial role in the advocacy to advance the rule of law and the reform of the state. And you could particularly think about the reform of justice. That is a huge challenge in the DRC, a country that, as you know, is has the size of half Europe, that doesn't have enough judges, not enough courts. So UNGHRO was crucial to promote all the audience foraine, the mobile courts that are going through the country to apply justice. UNGHRO was also very important, for example, when you look at all the policy making around transitional justice. So you could speak a lot, actually, but of course there is. And I was at the beginning talking about the arrest of this journalist. UNGHRO was very important, is still very important to protect human rights defenders, and I guess Asatu will speak more about it. Yes, so you could see this individual protection as well, very main role, and particularly when we went Goma as well, where during this state of siege context. And shrinking of political space, the idea of a protection of individual protection was very central. Just to try to wrap up a bit, and it's very complicated when you want to speak about human rights in the DRC and to speak about MONUSCO. As Wendy mentioned, we as Civic, we are working on transitions aspects particularly. And what we have seen is that, this period of transition in the DRC and was particularly looked at from different points of view, because the transition are very crucial moments in terms of human rights. We have examples in non-mission contexts. For example, when you look at what is happening today in Sudan, you had a transition that was not really, supported by international community. And then you see the conflict that is happening today, even after the tremendous effort that civil society organizations and civil society in general had, in changing the story of this country. But in the context of UN peacekeeping missions, you have also concrete examples of what could work when you have two things: when you have resources and when you have political support. And this seems to be the biggest challenges when we interviewed the people we met either in Kinshasa and in Goma, or online thanks to Zoom. You could see how worried people were, knowing that during the transition, the resources of OHCHR would decrease. As you may know, that 75% of the capacities of human rights components in the DRC are under the mission. So what does it mean when the missions leave? When the mission leaves, how will the human rights team be able to monitor the situation in this huge country with just 20 staff? How will it be possible then to produce reports that will inform policymakers? How will it be possible to also talk about this whole, prevention aspect that the Secretary General want to emphasize on, without this monitoring, and without also the protection of the people monitoring on the ground? So all those aspects were discussed in our very huge, interesting report, and I really hope you will like it and learn a lot from it. Yes, so these are the biggest questions we had. And if I could just finish, and I guess it would be a good transition as well. The question of, the legacy of what is gonna happen to human rights defenders once the mission leaves, once the human rights components is not there anymore, or not there with the capacity it had before, was really in everyone's minds. And this is linked to, member states' will to continue to support the human rights aspects of the UN presence in the DRC or other contexts, of course.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Really sobering analysis of DRC, which remains obviously an area of concern for a really long time. One of them, the quotes that we had from civil society leader in Goma that I shared with Security Council members the day before yesterday in New York, was that civil society leaders in Goma told us they were afraid the international community would punish us and abandon the DRC. They said the only stabilization they see is, quote, one of permanent insecurity, unquote. And they tell us that people are afraid that the same military whose primary duty is their primary duty to protect them. So obviously those concerns of the people, of the civilians there, remain extremely high as the mission is under a great deal of pressure to begin to consolidate its presence. There was a lot there that I won't try to summarize, but this idea of sort of shrinking civic space as well of diminishing resources and political support, and that these are sort of two of the key ingredients for allowing human rights work to continue, I think are quite important to keep in mind as we hear from a human rights defender. Hasatuba Minte is the head of the Africa desk of the International Federation for Human Rights, joining us with a lot of experience in the Sahel and elsewhere. From your viewpoints, Hasutu, why do you think this work is important? And I suppose, how do you see it? How can the work be made more inclusive and more sustainable? I think especially as it relates to better support for civil society and civil society-based organizations.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, again. Thank you to Civic, to GCSP, and all the partners who organized this very interesting discussion. Before I start, I would like to take at least 1 minute, maybe, to introduce FIDH to those who may not be familiar with the organization. So FIDH is a centenary-old INGO defending human rights and committed to work on the universality of human rights. That means that, of course, we also have to focus. And the first focus of FIDH for the past years has been to support and contribute to the protection of human rights defenders. This is the core of the work we do. I would say the second key focus is the issue of justice, contributing to effective justice and to the fight against impunity. The third one is to contribute to the strengthening of the rule of law and of democratic governance. I would like to add two more that are also related to the work we do at the Africa Desk on the promotion and the protection of women's rights, especially in crisis and conflict situation, with a key focus on fighting sexual and gender-based violence. And the last one on supporting affected communities by the operations of business, especially international firms, when they operate, be it on the environmental or the ESCR rights, etc. So this is just to give in a nutshell the work we do. In Africa, we have 40 members, dozens partners, and this is the experience I will be speaking from. We have indeed worked a lot on the Sahel, especially in Mali, with a joint program we have carried out on the fight against impunity for the past 10 years. And on the DRC, we've been committed to work on the issue of the fight against impunity and the protection of human rights defenders for the past at least 20 years. The key messages, concerns, and recommendations I'd like to share related to your questions is that first, we feel that there is a big need to support and contribute to an effective, diverse, strong, and independent civil society. So let us say that the work we saw that was done within the framework of MINUSMA and MONUSCO, for instance, in gathering civil society, enabling synergies, fostering dialogue in civil societies has been really a productive and a very positive role in strengthening the capacities of civil society. This has really enabled the development of platforms who are engaged on key concerns, be it on the protection of human rights defenders, on different thematics that I highlighted as an introduction, to have concrete actions to support institutional reforms, legal reforms. Human rights defenders and civil society was able to better organize themselves thanks to also that support, be it in the DRC and in Mali, from what we have experienced. The second thing under that item is really that it has, I think, as those two operations are concerned, there was also a key role in contributing to an effective and a peaceful dialogue with the national authorities and other key and relevant actors. We have to say that in many of those countries, civil society doesn't have all the tools or the keys to engage, I would say, on the same level with those actors. And having the UN operation, and especially the human rights divisions, supporting them interacting with relevant actors and even with national authorities sometimes who actually diminish, we have to say, the importance of human rights defenders, that gave them also the power to go further in the recommendations they made and to be more proactive in the solutions they would propose. Thirdly, it is also important to say that The last point is also a lot about protection. Protection of human rights defenders, especially for their physical and psychological integrity. What I mean is having the UN and especially the human rights divisions involved and being side by side with civil society in countries. It's also a way to contribute to them being in a safer space, being maybe safer than what they could have encountered. We know the context in the DRC, in Mali, where human rights defenders have been facing for many years arbitrary arrest and detention, harassment, acts of intimidation, several threats, even enforced disappearances. As we speak, I will not speak of Mali this time, but of Burkina Faso, where human rights defenders and activists are being completely abandoned to a junta who is actually imposing its views and going to fetch people at their houses or at their work and taking them to the military front for them to contribute to the war instead of making what they mention as having a dissenting voice or making opposition statements as they come. So it is important for the UN operations and the specific stakeholders to make sure that they are also taking into account the issue of protection when they interact with civil society, with human rights defenders at national level, but also at regional and international level. This is, for instance, when there are any UN-related events and when civil society is asked to contribute, to engage. We at FIDH have witnessed many cases of reprisals. Reprisals for human rights defenders and activists who come to Geneva or to New York or any other place where they share their views and concerns and recommendations are very, very numerous. And often people, when they come back to their countries, are facing reprisal from national authorities in various ways. We had a case, not on Mali, for instance, last year in a space here in Geneva. We had a case 2 years ago that was in New York. We had other cases on other countries. I will not list them, on Djibouti and others, which are not part of this study. But it is a very worrying trend. And what is even more worrying is the lack of mechanism or concrete action that is put in place by the UN system as a whole, I would say, at this stage, to ensure that there is a security assessment ahead of this type of activities before human rights defenders engage on those forums. Secondly, we feel that after they return in their countries, there would be a need to improve the follow-up, the security follow-up, to ensure that they are in a capacity to return safely to their places, to continue their work in the best capacity, or that mitigation measures are taken to ensure this. This is something FIDH and other partners from civil society are working a lot on to support, but it's really not enough compared to the needs. The second issue to us is really about ensuring a comprehensiveness and complementarity aspect or approach in the issue of monitoring and documenting human rights. Basically, in these two missions that I'm more speaking of, MINUSMA and MINUSCO, concrete mechanisms were put in place to monitor human rights. Key fact-finding missions were led, be it in the north of Mali, in the center of Mali, in the Kasai, for instance, for the DRC, in the eastern Congo, etc. Key fact-finding mission happened, reports that we all know. I will not say again that we are still expecting a lot from the follow-up of the mapping report. This is something I think we all have in mind. We have in mind also the report that was issued by MINUSMA after the massacre of Moura in Mali. And yet we have little visibility on the follow-up of this action. So it's not only about the follow-up from the UN, of course, it's also about how civil society can contribute to this follow-up. How is the civil society involved to implement the recommendations of those reports and engage with national authorities to ensure that there is actually an effective fight against impunity. We know that in most cases, national authorities open investigations, sometimes judicial investigations. We also know as activists that investigations are open but are never closed. and it's a way to just keep them ongoing with no response happening. So this is where civil society has a role to play to ensure that, the judicial system is also taken into its responsibility to move forward on those cases. And human rights defenders working with MINUSMA at the time and still working with MONUSCO maybe lack sufficient support to contribute effectively to this. I'd like to go on two other points related to monitoring and documentation. It's about, indeed, the support also to the good administration of justice. There was a very great work that was done at MINUSMA and its division on justice that worked closely with key judges that were in charge actually of key investigation on violations committed in the north from 2012 to 2013, but also violations committed in the center of Mali since 2018. All those judges have been supported by MINUSMA, had some capacities also strengthened. They had collaboration and cooperation with the ICC and with other relevant stakeholders. So a lot of work was done. And now that MINUSMA is gone, we feel that something is left to be done. So where, again, the administration of justice, it is good to work with the judiciary, of course, but it would be good to also involve in a more comprehensive manner human rights defenders to do so. As FIDH, we are civil plaintiffs in cases in Mali. And for instance, we had to face those judges to bring witnesses and victims to those judges for auditions. And of course, we worked a lot and we have a very good collaboration actually with MINUSMA, but we really feel that we could have gone one step further. Maybe on the fight against impunity, the last point would be to also strengthen the cooperation with, I already mentioned national courts, but I think it's also important to enhance the cooperation with regional and international mechanisms. We have to admit that it has been recalled earlier that the human rights context in most of those countries is very gloomy, is very hostile. So it is important to find other avenues and other ways to keep the fight against impunity on the top of the agenda. So regional courts can be sometimes fragilized by political instability or political tensions, but they are still there. And it is our role collectively to ensure that they are in a capacity to do their work. So I'm thinking of the ECOWAS Court, of the SADC Court, the East African Court of Justice, when relevant, and of the International Criminal Court, of course. Lastly, I would say the last point I would like to discuss before I give back the floor would be the issue of taking a leadership role in supporting human rights and the centrality of human rights in conflict and crisis resolution. It has been said as an introduction, but to us it is also an issue of how the UN representation, and especially at the highest level, should take a clear stand whenever possible, as much as possible, and despite the risk and threats. Why? Because they are in the best place and in the best protected place to do so. And to ensure that human rights are perceived by national authorities, by the civil society, even by the population, as a key component of the conflict resolution. And secondly, by doing so, they are also contributing to the protection of civil society, of human rights defenders, putting them in a better place to speak, putting them in a safer place, a more open space to speak and to feel that they have trust, that they have confidence, they have support, and that they can be interacting with any stakeholder on this issue. I think there is a lot more to say, but we'll have more opportunity in the Q&A. I hope I tried to cover your questions, and I'll keep the rest for the Q&A. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassatou. There was so much richness there that I really do hope we can get into in the discussion. You know, so many different specific ways that work, when it's done together, works really well. And then when there are gaps for various reasons, I would love to explore, some collaborative thinking around how one can fill those gaps, including especially on this issue of protection from reprisals that you mentioned, which is such a long-standing challenge for human rights defenders. I'd like to turn over to Dr. Claudia Pfeiffer-Cruz, who is part of the research team for this study. She is with SIPRI, so the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Claudia has also worked on another study, or is working on another study which is forthcoming, that looks at mapping human rights activities in different UN peace operations and their expected impact in host countries. Again, this focuses on the role of human rights in peacekeeping and then special political missions, and then how they contribute to some of their operational strategies, especially for supporting national and local sort of human rights work in host countries. With that, I turn over to you, Claudia.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. If you know Stockholm at this time of the year, you know that I'm truly sorry that I couldn't come to Geneva, but I'm glad that we could arrange this online. So the research that I will discuss a little bit here today is a project that we started at SIPRI, a little bit with the objective of developing the human rights pillar in the Peace Operations Program. This is a bit based on an exploratory research to try to better understand the work of human rights within peace operations and their impact on the human rights situation in host countries. So we interviewed personnel from human rights divisions across 8 different UN peace operations, so including both peacekeeping operations and special political missions, to first sort of map what are the main activities that this personnel conducts on the ground. And second, to identify the theories of change, that is how they think that these activities contribute or not to the human rights situation in host countries. And I think that better understanding the work carried out by human rights divisions, and perhaps not only from human rights divisions, but civilian personnel in general in peace operations and their potential impact. It's particularly important right now that we are increasingly seeing more militarized peace operations, such as the ones in the DRC, the ones that the East African Regional Force that closed recently, but also semi-DRC that opened recently. And or in general, more militarized responses to conflict. So I think that in a paradoxical way, this is a very good moment to shed a light on the important work that has been carried out by this personnel and their potential effects on the human rights situation in the host country. And I think that this study that we are launching right here today, plays a very important role in doing this, especially because, as Wendy mentioned, we do have very specific and rich examples. So I invite you all to have a look at that. This is also through envisaging the recent publication of the new Agenda for Peace, and the notion of the need to prioritize a comprehensive approach to peace over securitized responses. So in a nutshell, based on our interviews, we identify a broad range of activities that human rights divisions carry out, and we group them in 5 different clusters. So perhaps there are some that are more intuitive ones. As both Charlie and Wendy mentioned, there is much of the work that is done in terms of human rights monitoring, investigating, and reporting. So this involves the active collection, verification, and use of information to protect and promote human rights. But we also find that lots of the activities are done in terms of advocacy efforts. And this is primarily about engaging with both local and international stakeholders to promote human rights reforms. A third cluster of activities that we identified is on capacity building. So this includes activities designed to enhance the skills and abilities of local organizations and individuals to protect human rights, but also focus on education and training and technical support. And this is related to what Asatou mentioned recently on the need to build a strong civil society, especially in the context of transitions. A fourth cluster that we identify is on outreach, which is usually designed to raise public awareness about human rights abuses and also on how to report them. So for this, human rights divisions have been using various media, including radio, but also increasingly social media channels. And lastly, a fifth cluster of activities that we identified is related to victim support and is based on providing immediate protection and assistance, including psychological support and facilitating access of victims to justice, and not only to victims, but also those that witness human rights abuses. And these 5 clusters of activities, they are designed in theory to achieve what we identified as 3 main lines of outcomes. So we talk a lot about prevention of human rights abuses. So this is one of them, but there is lot of this work is focused on mitigation of human rights abuses and also remediation of human rights abuses. And of course, there's always this idea that much of the what we see as remediation is it's also related to accountability, and then accountability often plays a role in terms of prevention. But prevention is basically focused on deterring potential violations by mainly educating what could be seen as potential perpetrators and protecting vulnerable populations to reduce the chances that abuses are committed. And mitigation efforts, they focus on minimizing the impact of ongoing violations. And this can happen through focusing on responsive governance and enforcement actions or collaboration to enforcement actions and ensuring that human rights violations are addressed effectively. And remediation activities are crucial for healing and rebuilding, and they focus on restoring the dignity and the rights of victims, ensuring that accountability is moved forward, and facilitating systemic changes to prevent further abuses in the future. This, of course, is a very summarized version of these findings or exercise, if you may, but it's also a summarized version that one can clearly see that the expected outcomes that are resulting from the work of this personnel on the ground concern not only the human rights situation in host countries, but it's a part of a broader strategy for long-term and sustainable peace and security in these countries. And I think it's important to say this because we repeatedly hear or we say that militarized answers, that there are no militarized answers for conflicts. But if this is actually the case, and I think it is, we should be looking a little bit closer and what else we can put on the table for having this comprehensive approach to peace. And as Abigail mentioned, and Charlie as well, how can you give them enough resources so they can actually do what we expect them to do? So for the sake of time, I will stop here, but I will be glad to get a little bit more into details of this in the Q&A later. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Claudia. I really appreciate that that link to some of the other research that you were also involved in. That is a lot that we've covered, and with no pressure at all. I'll turn it over to Matthias Benke, who's the chief of the Africa 2 division, which covers West and Central Africa, if I understand that correctly, for the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We've drawn on lots of examples here of the kinds of work that that human rights divisions do in the field, but also about how it enables a much broader spectrum of work. I think it's also useful to think of it in terms of the outcomes, as Claudia just presented, around sort of prevention, mitigation, and remediation. And then, we've heard from Hassatu about how some of that work involves engaging with civil society as well. And then we've looked at a range of different kinds of UN presences. So I suppose the main question is, how does all of this resonate with you, and what do you think are some of the important takeaways for the audience? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, but also thank you for doing the study. I think there is a lot of lack of information about what we actually do. And I think your study has done a great job in terms of shedding light on that. So that's really a big thanks. First, in terms of human rights and OHCHR, I should just maybe say who we are and what we do, and then I'll talk a bit more some of the points. We're a much younger baby than FIDH. We're only 30 years old. The Office of the High Commissioner was established at the Vienna Conference in December '93 with the post of the High Commissioner. Before that, it didn't exist. There was only a secretariat or Center for Human Rights. The first field presence of human rights anywhere in the world was in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. So we're really a child of the post-Cold War, because in the Cold War, there wasn't much appetite to empower internationally human rights in the way that you possibly have seen afterwards. And that's maybe indicative of where we are now. I hope it's not, but anyway, we'll see. What do we do? I mean, and that I'll do it very short, but OHCHR supports as an institution the human rights components in peace missions. We are the institution backing all those human rights components. The head of a human rights component in a peace mission is a representative of the High Commissioner. And we have made a principled decision that when there is a peace mission, we integrate into a peace mission. We don't have separate field presences anywhere, which is, by the way, why in the DRC we have the Joint Human Rights Office, which is the merge of the human rights component and a standalone OHCHR office with a mandate, and I'll come back to that later on. We also, and this is important for transitions, have other human rights components in the field, whether it's standalone offices, human rights advisors to resident coordinators, or regional offices. We play a key role in designing peace missions in terms of the human rights component. When the council decides to set up a mission, we will be there to see what and how the human rights component should look like. And on a daily basis, we support the human rights colleagues in the field. And we do that together with colleagues here in Geneva and colleagues in New York. Until recently, I oversaw our work in 3 missions, MINUSMA, which doesn't exist anymore, and MINUSCA and MONUSCO. And we have what we call triangular meetings quite regularly, where we field New York and Geneva in terms of what we do. That ensures a lot of coherence within the mission, within the human rights work that's done, but also that we do the liaison at various headquarters locations. Now, in terms of the study, and just I tried to boil it down to kind of maybe five points. I think one thing that's important that comes through with the study, and I haven't read it in detail, but also from the presentations and so on, it demystifies human rights a bit, and that's important. There's sometimes a view that human rights is this, glorious, kind of religion type thing that stands on a mountaintop and is very kind of esoteric in a sense. I think what is important for human rights work and for human rights in general and to talk about it is to talk about the nitty-gritty stuff, to demystify it, to really deal with it as a tool that has been devised by the international community to deal with the challenges that we face. I always say that human rights is a great tool for managing diversity, for managing complex states, if you did it in the right way. But in a sense, that's what we're trying to do with human rights work, is to try to give practical help to addressing issues, not to kind of preach or do anything like that. So it's really quite, I always have kind of a very minimalist approach in terms of doing that. And that helps when you actually work on the issues to focus on concrete stuff, but not, stay aloof. So that's I think is a key point for me that I think this study helps illustrate. Then in terms of the roles of human rights in peace operations, you've done a fantastic job in terms of outlining them, and you've pretty much captured most of them, especially all the visible ones. And I'll come. That's my third point: the non-visible ones. I think the analysis, the reporting, monitoring, of course, the protection of civilians thing. Nobody mentions the HRDDP issue. Some of you may not be familiar with this. This is what we call the human rights due diligence policy, where the whole mission as such has an obligation to ensure that none of the work done by a mission by the UN is complicit or helps in committing human rights violations. That's particularly relevant in the security aspects, but also it goes a bit beyond, or is being worked at going a bit beyond. I think your point about economic, social, cultural rights is a good point. Often that is neglected, and it is important to look at in a broader way. I'll come back to that in some of the challenges I think that we have on that later on. Certainly, and we've seen a tremendous progress over the past, let's say, maybe 15 years on working with police and the force, military forces. That cooperation has deepened and is really much more sophisticated and sustained when we have it, working than it used to be, because there used to be a huge distance and misunderstanding, and a lot of work that has been done by you and others in terms of, closing that gap is there. Interacting with state authorities and civil society, as also Hassatu mentioned, is absolutely essential for us to be able to do our work. Now, and that's the third point. There's also a lot of stuff that we do that nobody sees. You talk a bit about it, in terms of the advocacy, but also I would say there's a lot of human rights diplomacy going on. We engage because of the networks that we have, and this is what makes it interesting to work in human rights component. You meet with everybody. You meet with victims of human rights violations, prisoners, political opponents, civil society actors, national human rights institutions, business leaders, government leaders, presidents, everything, is the fact that we can play a role in the background to help solve specific issues. Whether they be issues, for instance, of legislation, when a piece of legislation is being prepared, we sometimes don't go out and do anything public, but we talk quietly to the government to say, you may want to do differently, because we don't want to put the government in a difficult position, but rather want to try to persuade them to change. We negotiate access to detention facilities, access that we sometimes even keep quiet about, but has a huge protection impact. So that's a protection role that is often not seen in terms of the work that we do, because we're often sometimes seen as doing a lot on the public side. Now, and that's the next point, transitions. I wanted to say a bit about transitions. I'm involved in a few of them. It's a very complex and challenging thing that doesn't only involve things that we nor the UN is in charge of. I think one of you alluded to the fact that UNITAMS was closed, the mission in Sudan, the political mission was closed because the government asked for it. The same thing was with MINUSMA. MINUSMA came very suddenly, where the government said, leave, and the Security Council actually accepted it. I think there were some people who said that was used as a negotiating strategy by the Malians, which backfired because the council actually accepted it. But the mission was by no means done with the situation. There are massive human rights challenges left in Mali. The problem that we had there is that we had no other presence on the ground. And we cannot just establish, by just walking in, a human rights presence in Mali, because it will require a deal with the government. And somebody mentioned the Moore report. The Moore report was one of the things that the government really rejected. It was quite a serious report about that we spent a lot of time on, because it was very serious. And the government decided to start judicial criminal prosecution of our staff. They didn't know who the staff were, but they started and they announced it publicly, that they were going to prosecute criminally our staff who had been involved in that report. To this day today, they haven't withdrawn that order. And that makes it then complicated to, address these issues and actually work on a good transition, even though that's, I think, what we all want to do. So I guess what I'm saying is that the transition in that sense was really out of the Security Council's hand in a sense, because the country in question didn't want to work anymore. And also we're a bit tied on that. We're working on issues, but I'll keep that to maybe a bit later. Liberia, we did a great transition. It was a fantastic transition. We opened an OHCHR office the day the mission closed. And this was based on an engagement with the government. There was an agreement to do it, and it worked very well. And the office is still there working actually right now. So there was a whole kind of planning of the phasing out of the mission, and then a nice transition into a country office. And I mean, your point about transitions being key, I completely agree with. And it's sometimes something that isn't maybe used enough in a comprehensive way, because often the focus is very much on the orderly withdrawal of the mission. And then there's a kind of a scramble for what comes afterwards, because there is a fundamental change in how the UN works. And DRC is a bit where we are right now, because the DRC transition is nominally without an end date from the council side, even though the government has said there is an end date. The mission is withdrawing from South Kivu right now, and South Kivu is by no means peaceful, on the contrary. You can then debate, why is the government then keen on, and I don't have the answer, on getting rid of a mission when actually it will create a security vacuum that cannot be fulfilled by any of the UN actors that are left on the ground. And there we may come into national politics or whatever it may be, but that's another challenge in terms of actually making a transition that is meaningful happen in a good way. Now, and I know I've just really touched on just a very few things, but I just wanted to put these things on the table. Challenges. I think, and my points right now illustrate that, it is vital for human rights to be able to do its work, whether in peacekeeping missions or outside, that you do respect the impartial character of the work that we do. We're not doing political work. Our work is based on international human rights standards, standards that countries have often ratified and freely acceded to. If we are seen or being made to seen as the implementers of a policy of any country whatsoever, or working against any country whatsoever, our credibility and our capacity to have an impact goes out the window. Right? I mean, one of the things that I've said, I was in New York last year, and I spoke to the members of the Security Council that were all the penholders for the Security Council resolutions. I said, from my perspective, the key ask we have for you is protect our impartiality and the integrity of the human rights mandate for us to be able to do it. Don't make it political in any way whatsoever. That then links again with another challenge is, of course, the political situation in the Security Council. I mean, some of you alluded to it right now, is if you don't have a consensus in the Security Council about the importance of the human rights mandate, it's weakened already. I mean, that's not about the impartiality, but it's just that some members will not want to do it or abstain from it and so on. And that's an issue which we face very much when it comes to peace missions, because we are subject to the will of the Security Council. And that's, of course, something that we have to navigate, and the Council does whatever they will do. And but it is something that is a challenge. Another thing that's a challenge, and I said I would come back to it, and that's on the economic, social, cultural rights thing, is the black and the blue UN. Maybe some of you have heard about it. The humanitarians, maybe some also development actors, see themselves as the quote-unquote blue UN. They want nothing to do with anything that is militarized or anything like that. That is the black UN. The black UN are peacekeeping missions, are the military components, the police components, and so on. And these are all heavily politicized. So there's a big split in the UN in that sense. And because we integrate we're often seen as being the black UN, which hampers, and unfortunately so, I would say, and I think that's maybe one thing that if anybody has some great ideas, please let me know, how to bridge that thing with the so-called blue UN. That cooperation needs to be strengthened. Interestingly enough, it doesn't happen when we are in standalone country offices, where we are based as an OCHR office, we are seen as being part of the blue. But when we're in a peace mission, even though we do exactly the same job, we're seen as being part of the black one. And that's an internal challenge for the UN in terms of how we operate, even though, and that's another discussion, a lot of work has been done on integration of peace operations and UN operations and so on. But I think some work still needs to be done. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthias. I think it's really helpful to think of it in the terms of the sort of 5 areas, and this idea of sort of invisible work, I think, is really, again, really important that some of the research and the discussion today highlights. I'm afraid that we have, in our robust interrogation of the issues, have left very little time for discussion. But maybe if I can just open it for like 2 minutes. I did receive a few questions online, but are there any sort of very quick burning questions, thoughts from the audience here in the room? And then I can give a last round to the panel for comments. Any burning thoughts, questions from the audience? Please. Mike, or they can pick it up. Okay, gentleman in the back first, and then.
I hope you can hear me. My name is Aribani Ibashi. I am working with the ICRC on the protection of civilians. And I've been listening carefully to all the panel experts who intervened. And we heard a lot about the advocacy work that needs to be done, the capacity building to the civil societies, the worries that the populations are having in Goma and in Mali on the fact that the UN missions, the peacekeeping are putting out. I heard a little or not much about those who have the duty to actually implement these human rights laws. I think that there is also a lot of work to do on that side, on the support to the duty bearers, in order for all this to materialize. Because we can do advocacy, we can support the civil society. If the governments themselves, they are not having the right structures, the right systems, the right competencies, and even the human and financial resources to implement all this, we will continue facing these issues over and over again. And we will have the problem where, when the peacekeeping missions are pulling out, the same spiral of violations will continue. So I wanted to ask what was done in order to support these duty bearers, or what can be done. For us at the ICRC, we are more and more convinced that this is an important work that needs to be done, because the implementation of these international standards, it depends as well on the capacity of the local ecosystems to absorb and to operationalize all these conventions that they sign. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gérard-Baldé. Adam, Dr. Adam Davies is one of the researchers as part of this study, as well as Emma Bapt, who's also here in the audience. Adam.
Just a super quick one. Many of you mentioned mission transitions and missions phasing out. We've got MONUSCO on the kind of front burner. I think Iraq is also not a peacekeeping mission, but it's SPM that's on its way out. MONUSCO is probably next up. Is there anything specific from your research that you'd say the Department of Peace Operations or OHCHR should be doing now that they're not doing based on your research?
Great, thank you. I think from the online, we had similar sorts of questions, and I think a couple around transitions as well. So maybe some of the, and I had lots of my own, but I know we are out of time, so I think I will restrain from further interrogation. Maybe we leave it to those few areas, and maybe I think with a specific emphasis on sort of concrete recommendations to the extent you can conjure those. Maybe we go down, starting with Charlie, on both Erebani and Adam's questions, again with a focus on recommendations, which I know we didn't get much time to talk about.
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief, and particularly on transitions. I think Abigail, in the Congo context, having done other research as well, may have good things to add there. But I mean, what we recommend is fundamentally driving a more rights-based transition. So thinking through what those capacities are, what benchmarks around human rights might be meaningful to measure the protection of political space, reduction of abuses, like what kinds of things can be put in place, drawing on existing capacities and mechanisms that are in place, but they can be elevated and emphasized and then necessarily resourced in order to support those transitions. But I think what Matthias was saying about that kind of institutional transition for OHCHR as well is really important, whether it's in relation to a country team or having an office, opening an office, thinking through those specific details, really important. I'll just say, if it's okay, one thing on your question. So I was trying to talk about the capacity building activities that are done by missions in support of state capacity. And there's a lot of examples in the report about, particularly around national human rights institutions, and the work that missions do to try and build up the capacity of host states to live up to their responsibilities as duty bearers, as you rightly point out. I think the one thing I'll add is, from my time, we were in South Sudan together, Wendy and I, with our team, and it was quite clear that the politics of having a National Human Rights Institute become truly independent and actually be able to work towards those Paris principles and actually meet those criteria was certainly blocked. It wasn't possible. And when those institutions are politicized and it's possible to do that, then there's only so much that the human rights capacities of the UN in mission can do. And actually, there's an interesting thing, this will be my final point, Wendy. Matthias, you mentioned the black and blue UN, but actually in South Sudan, what was interesting is even within OHCHR, there's a distinction between the Commission of Inquiry, the Commission, and HRD within the mission. So some of those divisions are very real. They create real challenges to concerted effort and never mind integration. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charlie. Abigail, you want to pick up on any of those points? I think maybe especially around transitions and these recommendations, I think, which are twofold, support to national capacities, within sort of government and host institutions, but as well as sort of civil society organizations.
Basically, what we recommended in our report was to really, for member states to try to support joint programming. As you know, the report we wrote was really on how to better prepare at earlier stage transition. So the main recommendation we had was, of course, to start earlier and to reinforce joint programming and funding of programs that would not force, but kind of different components of the UN to work together, and the work of OHCHR within this joint programming exercise was particularly emphasized in our research. Mm-hmm. And to just maybe add on your question before on how to support states that are the duty bearers, in respecting human rights. Once again, the work of human rights components within mission is fundamental, because the human rights monitoring, for example, and particularly in the case of the DRC, allowed diplomacies that are the ones supporting or sometimes funding host states within the situation of missions or outside, But when you look at the DRC, for example, a lot of human rights violations were committed or are committed by state actors. So when you look at the documentation that was done by HR components, you have a key information for what kind of diplomacy, what kind of support will be after, led by member states to, accompany the duty bearers to respect human rights. And this is something that is still, at the center of the questions today when you look at all the resources disappearing in the context of transitions.
Yeah. Thanks, Abigail. I'd also add to that, I think the kinds of partnerships that the Security Council, I think in particular during transitions, can be more proactive in reaching out to have to do with those resources around mobilizing the IFIs, the kind of World Bank and co, on trying to make the resources available to support national institutions for things like SSR, which are really fundamental, especially in drawdown and withdrawal situations, where you've got a real lack of progress on some of, instilling some of these key sort of human rights doctrine, let alone sort of implementation aspects in their national institutions, as well as with, I'd say, like the Peace Building Commission and others to create a bit more space and political support for leadership to be able to use it for advocacy when they speak out, when the mission speaks out on human rights issues. Hasatu, over to you to pick up on any of those questions.
I will try. Thank you so much for the questions, but really in one word regarding the first one on how to include or support duty bearers and national authorities, states, etc. I would say it's less about support, because when you look at the budgets that are spent in terms of supporting, it has been said already, either the military or the security forces or the judicial system, as I highlighted, a lot of millions have been spent already. It's really about the political will and about making sure that we are also collectively keeping states accountable of the commitments they made freely, as it was recalled, to international instruments and regional national instruments for human rights. So basically, it is their first responsibility to ensure that they are moving and being accountable for this. So that would be the only way, I think, to move forward, not only about support, but making sure they are accountable. I think the last word would be just to highlight that such a study, I think, is really contributing to make sure that we all keep in mind that human rights is a collective responsibility. I know this expression has been used and reused, but let us make it not a vain expression. Basically, each stakeholder, each state, each institution, each international partner and civil society have a role to play. The key problem we are facing is the issue of having a coordinated and a well-articulated approach. And I would say that is where we expect, of course, more responsibility and support and action from the OACHR. But this is something civil society is really trying to contribute as much as possible in the with the means available, and something we need to look into in more details. I think.
Thank you very much, Hasatu. Just going and speaking order, Claudia, last words, points, responses to questions raised, if you're still
Yes, thank you. So I think that thank you very much for the questions. On the issue of transition, I think that the timing is really key here. So we really need to have benchmarks defined for transition, defined at much earlier stages. And this was something that came across in when we talked to many people when we were in the DRC, for instance. And in relation to integration, I think that human rights divisions in general, and not just the UN GHRO, can be a very good model for in the context of transitions, because they are double-headed, right? So they they are at the same part of the mission, and they are blue and black UN at the same time, as Matthias mentioned. And this is something that can play in their favor in terms of transition, because this can make we might have some lessons to learn from this. Let's see how this plays out in MONUSCO. Of course, in the case of MINUSMA, everything was a little bit more accelerated than many of us expected. But now, with a little bit more time, this is something that might play in their advantage in the context of transition. So this is what I think I have to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claudia. Last words.
Okay, I'll do it quickly. I mean, on the duty bearers, I mean, I would put it this way. That's what we're trying to do all the time. I mean, the legal framework for international human rights law is setting up the duty bearers. I agree on the collective stuff in terms of moving in that direction. But at the end of the day, you want to have a situation where you have state institutions that do, respect, protect, uphold, etc., all these rights. So you put all of these things that we talk about in place to try to get there. And that road is very long, and probably we get a lot of them wrong. But I think that is the ultimate goal that we share completely with the ICRC in that sense. I mean, a lot of the capacity building is the kind of more immediate stuff on that. But I mean, even the reporting and monitoring that we do usually ends up by saying, state, please do X, Y, and Z. Please hold people accountable. We're not holding people accountable. We're not a judicial institution. You have to do that because you said you would. You are the duty bearer. So I think you're right that the word wasn't used there, but I think it is the key framework for how we do it. We are, as the UN and intergovernmental organization, states are our masters, and they have set us up to help them do what they have decided is the right thing to do. I mean, that's the logic in a bit in that sense. On the transition thing, I think, I go back to what I said. It's a messy thing. It's not something that you can do nicely simply because the ruling framework completely changes. When you have a Security Council resolution, everything is set out there, the whole mission is there. The UN country team is kind of set around it, but that's it. When the mission goes, there's no Security Council resolution because the Security Council doesn't get involved in that. And maybe it should, as you said, Wendy, maybe it should say, okay, we're closing, but we still want to have a say on something. Whether the Security Council will actually do that, I'm not sure about. I think they will probably think that they go beyond their remit. But the transition is there, once the mission closes, you have a UN country team, which is composed of UN entities that each have their hierarchy and ruling network. Some of them report to the SG, some of them report to the executive bodies. That is not an easy thing. I completely agree. We do need to have rights-based transitions, but it's a very messy thing. The other thing for transitions is funding. Peacekeeping missions are funded from the regular budget. We don't have to think about getting funding. When we open a country office, we are completely funded by donor money because in very few places we have regular budget money. So you have to cater to donors. That puts a logic for the UN entities competing with each other, which is again another whole logic that comes into place. In terms of, Adam, your question, can something else be done? I think maybe what we need to look at is the entire architecture. And I'm purely speaking, this is, by the way, all of this is just my views. It's not the organization's. Are we conceptualizing peace missions in the right way? And if we conceptualize them differently, maybe we'll have a different transition. I don't know. I think we need to talk more and more to each other, if you want to say that. I think a lot of talking is already happening across the system, but sometimes the blue and the black thing, does come in the way, unfortunately. Just a side comment on the point about, within the UN. What happens with us is that we often get mandates put on our head, like commissions of inquiry, which are not even ours, which we service, but which are independent. And they're not within our command control structure, like the special rapporteurs. We service them, but they're at liberty to do and say whatever they want to say. And that's how things have been designed. I actually think it's a good thing that's designed like that, because it's a good thing that in the human rights sense, you have UN actors that are actually not within the command control structure of the whole thing, that gives them the freedom to actually sometimes say something that the guys inside maybe can't say. That there's disagreements, that's part of it. I think the way we take it is that's part of the design, the willful design of the system, which again comes out of the Cold War, blah, 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 blah. But, let's get the best out of it.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Matthias. I think with that, instead of wrapping up, especially since you were all kind enough to stay over time, we leave it there. And just thanks again so much for your coming today, and thanks so much for our experts for making the time and for the contributions today.
Thank you.